Welcome, friends and comrades. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Mary Wild to Emancipation's podcast. Mary, how are you today?
Hi, Daniel. I'm well, thank you. Really happy to be here.
Mary, it's fabulous to have you on. And I was a guest on your excellent podcast, Psychoanalysis in Cinema. Projections is the name of the podcast.
Yes.
And I was, we actually had a very interesting conversation about the role of class and its portrayal in Hollywood films, and I think, discussed like maybe half a dozen different examples.
Hmm.
That was very enjoyable a few years back, and I follow your work, and I'm very moved and sort of inspired by how you've created this platform, and you work with the Freud Museum in London to offer these public talks. And the kind of premise of your whole endeavor is that we can sort of bring the theoretical tools of psychoanalysis to interpreting the cinema.
Hmm.
And it's what I like about that is like it's very inclusive of a model, in the sense that every movie that you see is eligible to be interpreted. And so I guess listeners to your show learn a lot about Freud, Jung, Lacan, who I think are your primary sort of theoretical interlocutors. Although you
Hmm.
probably have others, I want to ask you about that too.
Yeah.
And so kudos on this very, very ambitious project, which has been happening. When did you launch Projections? How long has it been going on? And what was the initial idea behind it?
Well, thank you so much for those kind words, Daniel. And yeah, so the Projections Lecture Series at the Freud Museum began in August 2012. And at that time, I didn't have any sort of professional links with the Freud Museum or anything like that. I'd attended a public event that they held on philosophy, and I really enjoyed it. And I noticed that a lot of their events, their sort of public events, were geared towards, I suppose, the clinical side and literary aspects of psychoanalysis, but there was nothing really on film. And I thought this could be a good pathway in for me because I'm a cinephile. I was working for the British Film Institute at the time, and I was looking really for a way to marry the disciplines of psychoanalysis and cinema in a very sort of community oriented setting where lots of cinephiles could gather. It's very informal. I'm not attached to really any academic institution. It was primarily even for my own enjoyment because I do love analyzing film. And I was very fortunate. The team at the Freud Museum were very welcoming. We piloted a couple of lectures in those early days, and they sold out. Not on my account. My name was not, circulating anywhere. I think there just was a real hunger for
Wow.
psychoanalysis and film. And then it sort of just took off, and we did regular lectures. At that, and those, like pre-COVID, all of the lectures I delivered at the Freud Museum were at the venue, inside that space. But post-COVID, we had to sort of transfer online for obvious reasons. We have sort of continued the online model now, even though everything's reopened, of course, simply because of global reach. We just have so many people attending from various countries, and it's really opened things up. So that's really the sort of, in a nutshell, my experience with the Freud Museum. I'm very fortunate to be working with them.
That's incredible. And of course, you have just published a book which is inspired by this projection work, series that you've done, but like a kind of sub genre within that work on psychoanalyzing horror cinema, which has been like a big kind of thematic focus of yours, right? But like you obviously focus on all of cinema through a psychoanalytic lens. But you've
Mm-hmm.
recently published this book with Routledge. It came out this year in 2026,
Mm.
and this is your first book. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It's my first book. And this book really grew out of, yes, the work that I did on, my lectures. Certainly, that was I guess, the inception of what I was doing. But in fact, the book itself is an adaptation of short segments that I scripted for another podcast, actually, called the Evolution of Horror podcast, which is hosted by Mike Munzer. This is a podcast that is, it sort of really blew up. It's the UK's #1 horror podcast, and it has a very, very large following globally. And the producer and broadcaster of it, Mike Munzer, he was interested in the psychoanalytic angle of things. He himself, he's a cinephile, he's a film historian. I'm not sure that he is like traditionally versed in, or classically trained to look at psychoanalysis, but he has a natural curiosity for it, and he's very welcoming. He opened up his platform, and really since COVID, I've been scripting these little mini segments. They run about 10 minutes on select films. And after a while, we just kept going with it. And I sort of amassed all these little scripts. And I thought it would be great if we could actually put these together, myself and Routledge, and actually almost write a compendium to Mike's podcast. And that's what this book is. It's focusing on really 6 subgenres of horror films, including psychological horror, body horror, nature as horror, home invasion, vampires, and aliens. And I have 50 films that I cover inside this book, and it's all sort of from various psychoanalytic angles and concepts, mostly Freud, Lacan, and Carl Jung. And yeah, I sort of had a blast really with it. For me, my main purpose is to be a cheerleader for the psychoanalytic interpretation of cinema. And I love sort of, I guess, spreading the gospel, in a very sort of accessible and fun way. Because my main aim is to get people who are naturally curious about these things to look deeper at the concepts themselves and see that they can also apply them in their own subjective interpretation of the films that they enjoy.
Yeah, I love that. You have like this kind of pedagogy where you're sort of, I kind of indicated that there's like this universal element to your work in the sense that people that read the book, which I highly recommend people take a look at or listen to your show, it's sort of like an invitation to participate. It's not, you don't encounter a lot of the intimidating conceptual armor that you often do in academic writing on psychoanalysis. So that, but let me ask you, how did psychoanalysis for you personally become so central? And also, like, even though like you're bringing your own, you still do have like an academic rigor because you're still fluent in these concepts, right? So it's not like it's devoid of that. It's still present. I mean, I think we should acknowledge that.
Thank you.
But where did this arise? Did it arise from, I think you do mention in the opening about your experience in analysis. Was that the origin, doing analysis?
That certainly played a big part in it. I would say there's a sort of prehistory with that. When I was a kid, very young, 7, 8 years old, I had very vivid recurring dreams. And I would go to my local, sort of elementary school library where I grew up in Montreal. And I would ask to look up dream books. I had like this natural instinct for wanting to know what my dreams meant. And there wasn't any book like that for kids my age, but I was advised to go to a different library, like the secondary school library, and there was a psychology section there. And I remember as a little girl going with my dad, and I borrowed. They happened to have a copy of Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Now I asked to borrow that. Of course, I had no idea who this man was. I obviously couldn't read the book. Like it went right over my head. I got through maybe one page and I didn't understand it. But yet it still sort of comforted me and reassured me that that book existed and that someone had come up with an explanation for dreams, you know? And I sort of like held on to that. I had like placed my faith in that. And that alone was reassuring. But then years later, I sort of forgot about all of that. And then at university, I went to Concordia University in Montreal. There was a great professor there who herself was a psychoanalyst. Her dad was a Hungarian psychoanalyst, I think. Sort of, I think from the Firenze school. And she was great. She was just very inspiring, very just yeah, like enlivening in the way that she taught psychoanalysis. And I think she sort of gave names to things that were sort of occurring to me or dawning on me, and it was a real awakening. And then years after that, post my kind of, I suppose, more formal education in psychoanalysis at school, I did undergo psychoanalysis, a psychoanalysis myself for about under a year with like I guess a Freudian analyst. So that also gave me a lot of insight.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. And so now, when you watch a movie, just in general,
Hmm.
is it now impossible to sort of set to one side or to set down the conceptual interpretation? Are you just like, constantly overthinking films? And do you have to watch movies? I was wondering if you have to watch movies twice because
Hmm.
like I sometimes thought about that myself, like as a theoretician myself, right? Like you watch it one for enjoyment and then you kind of think about the interpretation, but then you follow it back up with like, or do you only need to watch a film once and just, because it's like, how do you enjoy a film
Hmm.
while also theorizing it?
That's a great question. It definitely for me is impossible to turn on my impulse for finding patterns. So I have noticed that I can't simply take it in and switch off that part of my brain that's constantly digging around looking for pattern and for deeper meaning, latent significance, all of that. So I've sort of had to accept that that's just my reality. And what has happened actually is that the enjoyment that I derive is very much a part of pattern recognition. So, yes, I will need to watch certain films more than once to, dive deeper and like sometimes like stop and look at some stills and really analyze things. But that's only the case if I feel like I'm going to be incorporating that film in my own work, in lectures, for podcasting, for future writing. If I'm watching a film and I know that I'm not enjoying it, I also have a very critical eye. I know what I like and I know what I dislike. If I don't like something, I sort of, I put it out of my mind. But I do realize that there is, when it comes to cinema, certainly, that desire to, for pattern recognition doesn't go away. Where I have noticed where I have some, in a way, like brain recess, that I feel like it's more like a liberatory space where I don't feel constantly my mind is working, and it's more like a relaxed kind of recess time, is if I watch um so trashy TV. I hope that's okay to admit. It's from like, for me it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. So I will sometimes indulge in like reality TV, and I've noticed that when I'm watching that, it's more like white noise. I sometimes do it while I'm doing other things. I can multitask, and I'm not thinking about pattern recognition, even though sometimes that appears. It does appear, but it's not all the time.
Oh, I no shame in admitting that. I'm happy that you admitted that. I think it's quite humanizing, actually. No, I mean, come on. I think we have to turn our brains off at some of the time.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I want to return later to asking you a little bit more about the art of podcasting,
Hmm.
what advice you might give to people aspiring to starting their own podcast.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, I think we'll kind of move to that later. But for now, I want to dig into the book itself,
Hmm.
ask you a few questions about the book. My first question about the book is how you decided upon the categories of
Mm.
body, nature, mind, aliens, vampires, home invasion. Was this something that emerged kind of quite naturally from the podcasting thematics that you had developed before? How were you thinking about that? I also had a question about zombies and
Yeah.
why zombies were not given more airtime. I guess maybe some films do deal with zombies. But maybe that's like perhaps that's you like vampires more than zombies?
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Am I right?
I am partial to vampires. I'm not gonna lie. But well, basically, the structure of this book is very much aligned to what Mike Munster put out on his podcast, Evolution of Horror. And so when he got me on board, so his project, he looks basically, as you can imagine, at various horror subgenres, and he started going through them one by one. And he has entire seasons that are mapped out around those various categories. So when he first began the podcast, I think it was back in 2017 or 18, um, he at that time I was a recurring guest on the show, but he hadn't started this little mini psychoanalytic segment, which we sort of named Wild About Horror. Um, and it was only during COVID times that he came up with that concept. So what you're seeing is very much exactly sort of my step by step, I suppose, progression on the podcast when I was submitting these little scripts. And so it actually began with psychological horror and the chapter on mind. And all the titles that you see, all 50 titles, I think bar 3 from the chapter on mind, specifically Possession, Paranormal Activity, and Kiss of the Damned. These 3 I sort of took the liberty of inserting them myself because I had a whole theory around feminine jouissance, and I wanted to include that under that chapter. But everything else you see, it was Mike Munster who programmed these films for his podcast, and he brought me on to write these scripts. Now, zombies was actually a very early category on his podcast. And I was a regular guest speaking sort of, just very informally with him about some zombie films in the early days. But at that time, my segment was not yet put in place. So that's the reason why there's no chapter on zombies, because I didn't write any scripts for it. But I am thinking of writing a volume 2 of Psychoanalyzing Horror Cinema. And when I do, I would like to take on zombies as well as slashers and ghosts. Those were some of the early categories that Mike had, which I had not contributed yet to at that time.
Thank you for that. I was wondering, so psychoanalysis has been critiqued by discourses such as Marxism and I think actually, by the way, this is sort of a bad critique, but let me just state the critique, for being kind of too centered on the psyche, on the mind, and therefore, you know, ignoring the central role of social power, for example, right?
Yeah.
In its own analysis of subjectivity. So therefore, from a Marxist point of view, you get a lot of critiques that psychoanalytic method is idealist, not materialist, right? And materialism is this sort of properly socially grounded form of critique, and psychoanalysis is thought to be kind of bankrupt in that regard. I don't agree with that point of view, in part because I think there's a lot of ways to interpret even Freud's work as actually quite materialist.
Yeah.
And Lacan has the idea of the unconscious, which is like already socialized, and he has a whole theory of the other that determines our desires. So it's like already accounts for this. So putting that to the side, that's a little proviso.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was wondering how you analyze social dynamics in these across these genres. For example,
Hmm.
do you ever sort of consider, or how do you, let me put, how do you consider um, social dynamics of a given time that determine the production of a show or of a particular film? Or do you tend to actually analyze films as sort of cut from their own temporality or from their own context? Like, how do you
Hmm.
situate in your application of theory and your analysis of them? How do you situate like the social field in which those films are made? Right. Like, for example,
Yeah.
I had one of my advisors for my PhD is this guy, Larry Rickles, and
Mm.
he is known for becoming famous um, for a short period of time for a book that he wrote called The Vampire Lectures.
Hmm.
And it's like Freudian analysis of the genre of vampires in both pop culture, film, and also in novels. And
Yeah.
he does like a historical genealogy of vampire discourse. And one of the things he pointed out was that you can actually analyze the popularity of vampire films in relationship to like capitalism and its crises, which I found very interesting.
Hmm.
And he like superimposes, like you can sort of see a correlation there.
Hmm.
How
That's
do
a
you
yeah.
theorize that? Yeah, how do you theorize the social, like what the even when we
Mm.
spoke a few years ago, we were talking about how if it wasn't for the 2008 economic crash, you probably wouldn't have all of these new
Hmm.
TV series and films on economic inequality, right? Because
Mm.
before 2008, it was sort of like Hollywood could kind of get away with not really focusing on that as a theme. And even the fact that Parasite was acknowledged by the Academy is interesting because I doubt the Academy or that an American production house could ever make a film like Parasite, for example.
Hmm.
So how do you account for the social dynamic and the context behind the films you analyze?
That's a great question. And it's certainly an area that I'm quite keen to learn about more and develop more in my own podcasting and writing practice. But I would say up until the point of when I started writing this book, or writing this book as in adapting former scripts to a book, I my main goal, I guess, was more to um, sort of like write about the topographical arrangement of the psyche and the way that from a Freudian perspective and also Lacanian view as well, the way that various parts of our inner world interact with each other. So it's much more like of an internal um, focus, I suppose. But having said that, I mean, of course, so much of psychoanalysis is interested in that in terms of staging these things. And Freud famously was very interested in maps and drawings and architecture and these sort of relationships of various parts of the psyche. But of course, there are just some films that compel us to look outward. It's not just about that internal dynamic. And in those situations, I was minded in my writing to also weave in points about class and gender and uh, just various sort of inequalities, oppression, tyranny, some political issues that are relevant in those films. In particular, so for example, in the section on the body, there's a segment on the movie Teeth, and the people in that story are of a sort of lower socioeconomic class, and they happen to live in a town where there is a lot of pollution, from a factory, and the air is poisoned, and equally the environment is poisoned with images of, women, and there's a lot of sexism, there's a lot of objectification of female bodies.
Mm.
So I took those things into account in that analysis. Equally in the movie, Jaws. In Jaws, that's the chapter of focusing on nature. Of course, we know that in Jaws, there is a lot of corruption at the political level, at the sort of local authority level, and that has an effect on the way that the plot progresses. I'm thinking of also, like, in the section on vampires, the movie A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. It's a fantastic, very groundbreaking vampire movie made by an Iranian woman, who's part of the diaspora community. She makes a critique about the kind of Iranian government's morality police, and the way that they treat women, and she sort of inverts that. It's a really very subversive and fascinating take on all of that. So I would have been remiss to not mention and talk about that,
For sure.
I am myself of Iranian extraction. Both of my parents are Persian. I grew up in the West, but I could see how important her messaging was, and I wanted to honor that and make sure that it had a place in my own analysis. And there's many other examples in the book where the plot is, really showing us something where the horror is taking place at the levels of class, gender, oppression, geopolitics. These things are inescapable, and those injustices find a way to be expressed through the lexicon of horror cinema. And I don't go out of, I would never want to avoid discussing those things. So it's something that I want to continue doing for sure.
Thank you for that. And I notice in reading your work that, you do pull from Jung, but I would say Lacan is your number one interlocutor. Is that fair to say?
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Now, feminine jouissance as a concept is very important for you because it appears across a lot of your points of analysis across different films and different genres. Like, it's not just like relevant to, just one particular genre or phenomenon. And I wanted to invite you to say a few things about its importance for you. And then in addition to that, I was wondering what recurring concepts seem to repeat when it comes to
Hmm.
horror cinema in general, such that
Mm.
perhaps, you see across all of these different thematic areas we're talking about, like nature, mind, body, the paranormal, vampires, etc. Do you
Yeah.
see like the return of certain core conceptual problematics? And like, if so, what does that indicate to you?
Let me answer your second question first, and I'll get to feminine jouissance. Yeah, it's great to think about that. What are the recurring psychoanalytic concepts that become relevant in the medium of horror cinema? Um, I definitely noticed there's some obvious ones, of course: repetition compulsion, the death drive, the mirror stage. Horror movies love the mirror stage. It's
Right.
really existentially terrifying. Now, and that's true whether the director is, you know, deliberately wanting to invoke the concept or not. In most cases, these directors are not well read on psychoanalysis. David Lynch claimed that he had merely heard of Freud and he had never heard of Lacan, and he's not trying to paint it by numbers. He's not doing that on purpose. Whereas other directors like David Cronenberg, Cronenberg is famously well-versed in psychoanalysis. He even directed The Dangerous Method about Freud and Jung's falling out. So he does try to implicate these things in a very conscious way. But either way, these concepts still become apparent. And that speaks to the robustness of these theories, that whether consciously or not, they become apparent in the kind of landscape of the film. So repetition compulsion, the death drive, the mirror stage, the Jungian shadow, the uncanny. The uncanny is a powerhouse for horror cinema, especially in the chapter on home invasion for obvious reasons. And beyond that, the sort of obscene superego, the obscene father, the internalized authority, and the damage that does to the psyche finds expression in horror cinema. There is a lot about just things that, well, there's some classic defense mechanism stuff like avoidance, projection, even like, I would say, in some ways, like intellectualization. There's a lot of subtle things going on in cinema that give us a sort of a way in to these, to a new understanding of these theories. And the one that I tend to think about the most, that is a big preoccupation of mine, is feminine jouissance. And I read about it a lot in the first chapter, as I said, on Paranormal Activity, Kiss of the Damned, and Mulholland Drive. Sorry, and Possession, rather. And the reason why I find it so compelling is because I think that it is really interesting to think about the place of female subjectivity in the popular discourse, the dominant discourse, and really, I suppose, think about the difference in what female desire is as compared to phallocentric societies that are organized around the desire of men. And that discrepancy alone produces a lot of horror for me. And I feel like there are just some films that seem to be naturally tapping into this horror and maybe sort of compelling us to pay attention to it and to take it seriously. And of course, sometimes people who are not, let's say, horror enthusiasts, they might watch a movie like Possession and think, oh my gosh, this is so distasteful, and they're sort of put off by it and they don't want to look. And they're put off at the level of aesthetics. But what they're missing out on in that confrontation, if they sort of just stay the course and really take on board and absorb the aura of Possession, a movie like Possession or Paranormal Activity or Kiss of the Damned, they're likely to gain an incredible insight and really become aware in a totally different way, on another dimension, I would argue, just what this discrepancy really implies. So there's so much that women are sacrificing, and not only that, the sacrifice implies that we are conscious of what we're giving up. I would say it's even worse than a sacrifice. There's so much in a phallocentric society that women are preconditioned to not even know about, in terms of our desire, our, let's say, physiological differences, our interests, our spiritual, quests, however way you want to name these things. There is not even a consciousness of what it is that we are capable of our potential, of what we want to aim for. That consciousness is snuffed out even before it has the right, the opportunity to burgeon. So I would say that the sacrifice is comes at a later stage for women who know what they want, but they simply give it up. A lot of us don't even come to the place where we know. And that's actually the reason why I'm already sketching out now my second book, where I will explain further my own interpretation of feminine jouissance, and I want to write in an autofictional style and chart my writing around the architecture of the plot of the sci-fi movie Contact. So where in the first book I'm writing about 50 films, in my second book I only will focus on one film, and that's Contact. And I'm going to write in an autofictional style because my belief is that the movie Contact perfectly demonstrates and illustrates the journey of feminine jouissance, and it is a real odyssey. And there is a lot of pain and suffering involved, but at the end of it, once those realizations are made, it's just so it's the most enriching journey that I think a woman can go on. That's my view. Sorry, that's a very long answer.
No, that's incredible. So you're talking about Jodie Foster's Contact from when was it?
1997.
Oh, that's an incredible show. Yeah, and I feel like there's also the Freudian theory of Oedipus seems to be present there insofar
Mm-hmm.
as the desire of the scientist, of the female scientist, seems to be about some higher reconciliation with a father figure, to my recollection. So that might be an interesting thing
Mm-hmm.
to also pursue and to analyze. So first of all, one great thing you do in the book is you have these glossary of definitions
Mm-hmm.
um, that are super helpful, where you define phallic jouissance and feminine jouissance and the Oedipus complex, like all of these. You sort of like the Unheimlich, I think, is maybe there, hysteria, the incest taboo, the mirror stage, etc. So all that's super helpful. I was wondering if you, and I think you may touch on this, but what about from the position of the spectator, the viewer
Yeah.
of horror? Could you talk about the reason why we get, like, what's the unique kind of quality of what draws us to horror? And
Mm.
maybe I could share like a quick anecdote to
Yes, please.
for myself, like, and I don't really know the answer to why this happened, but I remember when I was in high school, there was this show called The Blair Witch Project,
Mm-hmm.
and it was so terrifying because it was this like reality. Okay, it was like a potentially reality horror film where they may have discovered, like, the filmmakers like may have discovered like an actual like real life witch in the woods wherever they were, or something like that. And it possessed this like uncanny, and this was like at the time where like reality TV was actually becoming
Mm-hmm.
was growing and becoming more popular. And for whatever reason, like there was like a brilliant marketing campaign behind that movie, because my friends and I went to go see it, and I just remember like for weeks I was constantly thinking about that movie, and every time I went into the woods I was repeated the imagery of that film, and I would feel scared to go walk alone in the woods. And I was like a young man, or young, but I mean I should not have been so affected by it, but I was.
Mm.
And sometimes I actually worry when I'm not affected by horror films, in the sense that I think that it's healthy to be affected by horror films. I think there's something innocent about it, and it's actually positive, if that makes
Mm.
sense. Like,
I agree.
yeah, like in other words, if my wife and I watch a scary movie and we get terrified, it's such an amazing bonding experience on the one hand, and then on the other hand, like, I feel like a kid again if I'm like kind of terrorized by it, because I know that it will dissipate and it will go away. But
Mm.
like that's what I want. I want that high.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Maybe you
Mm-hmm.
could provide a psychoanalytic gloss on that. And then what
Sure.
does it mean to be truly affected by a film like I was with Blair Witch?
That's a great question. And I do tend to agree with you, by the way. I think it is very healthy for people to display a kind of reaction and be affected by the horror films that they watch. Because as you say, there is that kind of fun element. It's like the reason why people go to amusement parks and, haunted houses. You want that kind of dopamine hit, and it's just sort of a fun activity. But beyond that, what we might not consciously realize is that we are processing a lot of unconscious stuff all the time. And the horror movie gives us an opportunity, this safe little window that's kind of contained inside the frame of your screen, where you're presented material that is affecting you, but it's safe to process it because it's make believe. It's a film. It's not going to harm you in real life. So that's why I say in the book that horror is like an EMDR machine. It's certainly been my clinic. I've turned to it countless times to for whether consciously or not, for therapeutic value. So I do agree. I think when people say they're not affected by horror, either because they don't watch it, like they actively avoid it, or because they watch it and it leaves them cold and there's no response whatsoever. I think in both instances, that might be cause for concern, because in both, you're either avoiding it, so you're skirting around the issue of your fears, or you may be just very dissociated. And if you watch a movie and it's not affecting you, it might be because you've either zoned out or checked out completely. So I agree. I think horror is healthy. It's sort of like a kind of refresh, rearranging of stuff and reordering of the signifiers and a little bit of a tidy up inside all the time. And that's why in my dealings with people in the horror community, they're some of the most well-adjusted people I've ever met, because they're constantly like doing the work internally. Um, and as far as what you were saying about, what is it that's driving us really? And I love your story about the Blair Witch Project. That got me too. I was a young person in those days and I watched it, and uh, I avoided, my local little woods, for a while, for sure. Like it got under my skin. I totally bought into the marketing and they were very clever with it.
I know.
And it was such a unique thing at the time too, found footage films. That was a really
Right.
it was it was like a groundbreaking, innovative style of horror that we hadn't seen before, really. And you're right, it was coinciding with the rise of I guess reality TV, and I suppose it's sort of breaking down those barriers, that you're watching a movie, that it could happen to you. This is a found footage film. Maybe it could happen to you. So it's more personalized.
Right.
We become more identified with it because it hits closer to home. And I think primarily what is driving us, and the motivating factor for horror watchers, is a specific type of scopophilia
Mm,
and pleasure in looking,
mm,
where um, it is a type of it's so, I think what makes it so irresistible to a lot of people is that the suspension of disbelief that is required when we watch any film for us to be transfixed and engrossed and really enter into the psychic world of the film. Suspension of disbelief that cuts through every genre of film or show that we watch. We have to take it seriously. I think the suspension of disbelief in horror hits even harder because it's wrapped up in fear. And the scopophilia is like, a, you know, is so much more activated because of that. It's the same thing that compels us to look at, a car wreck as we're driving past. We shouldn't want to look at that, but we do look at it. We're more heightened. Everything is just more activated psychically. And so that's why horror is, it's sort of having a big golden age at the moment. I think it's also no coincidence that because of the state of the world, horror cinema does become more popular in times of crisis because people need a place to, in a way, process their fears. And the horror cinema realm becomes a more contained and safe place to do that.
That's incredible. I wanted to dig into the chapter on ecological horror.
Mm.
Um, because I guess that genre perhaps touches on the question that I asked you earlier of the social in interesting
Mhm.
ways, obviously, and like crisis, right? And so like I'm curious about this sort of idea, the idea behind this type of horror. And frankly, in a way, films about the end of the world or films about kind of nature run amok or like profound accidents that are born from natural catastrophes. I mean, in a way, those films seem to me to reveal our ontological insecurity
Mm.
at its most base level, right? Especially for our
Yeah.
generation, in the sense that we are told by the scientific community that like we are potentially like one of the last few generations that will have something like a kind of somewhat normal, natural, ecological way of
Mm.
life, and that
Mm.
from after that time, in a future that we could experience, everything's going to change. So
Mm.
it seems to me that the intensity of that futural like um direness is
Mm.
so present. But obviously also, just as a side point, many of the examples that you use don't have to do with the end of the world. But I'm curious
Mm.
actually how you might think of, because I mean, you use the example of Birds, Hitchcock, and you use the example of Jaws, which I
Yeah.
find very interesting.
Mm.
But I guess my question is, are end of the world horror movies, I guess they're usually categorized as action movies, or like,
Yeah.
I guess that's my question, is like, do they qualify um or not as
Yeah,
horror?
that's a great question. That's a great question, and that's certainly something that has been debated on the evolution of horror. And in that season, the host was really giving platform to a lot of these types of movies that you've just described. These ones that are primarily action films, but they're dealing in sort of the existential horror of the end of the world.
Right.
So, you know, alongside that, you could be talking about the, movies like Twister, or The Happening, The
Yep.
Ruins,
Yep.
Melancholia,
Epidemics.
actually.
Right. Epidemics.
Epidemics, yeah,
Yeah.
Epidemics, exactly.
Yeah.
The Bay, yeah, a lot of these, yeah, sort of films about like
28 days later.
28 days later. Yeah, exactly. Rapidly spreading viruses and pandemics, and ecological collapse, and nature turning on us in a kind of vengeful,
Right.
punitive way, to sort of restore harmony within
Mm.
itself. And so we're treated as human beings who are the ones that maybe have have actually orchestrated disaster unnecessarily. Humans are treated as the virus that needs to be extinguished because it is disordering nature. You're right. There is a lot of gatekeeping discourse around whether or not these types of movies are necessarily horror films, because they're primarily action films. And there's not the traditional horror tropes in them, but they do invoke an existential crisis.
Mhm.
And I think that we just see more and more films like this that are maybe, in some cases, might be exploiting the naturally occurring fear of the mainstream, because now we're so exposed to media talking about ecological collapse, and even like nuclear war and things like that. So some films just are, in a very cheap way, exploiting that fear just for profit.
Hmm.
Not every film made in this style has a meaningful contribution to make. It's sort of just, milking the cat, sort of milking the cash cow a bit. But there then are some other films that are very cleverly tapping in and engaging with that fear, and I think making us see that a lot of the attitude and a lot of the perspective when we think about our own demise as a species gets sometimes like occurs to us like in our own experiential reality, is felt in a very hyperbolic way and a very kind of catastrophized way that only accelerates the rate of the problem. So what sometimes these films, when they're really good, what they do is they hold up a mirror to society and say, um, there are so many dysfunctional things that we're doing in these modern times that are further destabilizing our nervous systems, further making us panic. And when we are panicked, we make horrible, desperate choices that actually make things worse. So I find that psychologically interesting. There's something in that about, mm, yeah, just learning about the ways that our own reactions are feeding into this cycle of, I suppose, like an acceleration towards total destruction. And in that scenario, there is no opportunity for cooler heads to prevail. We're all sort of like rushing towards the brick wall. Um,
Hmm.
so a lot of horror is very good at really just being a mirror to us as the audience, and it's very philosophically enriching. And I just hope that so much of this new art that is created is then interpreted in a productive way by the people who have uh, the political will and power to make reasonable decisions. Now,
Hmm.
recent history would tell us that we're in trouble because we don't have a lot of leaders like that, and there is a lot of recklessness and irresponsible actions being taken.
Hmm.
Um, but I just hope that there is some sort of artistic literacy that emerges with newer, younger generations, where we bring about social change and social justice in a meaningful way, not in a catastrophizing, accelerationist way.
For sure. No, I mean, I totally agree with many of those points. And I definitely love your general theory about what attracts us to horror. I had another question about the if you've thought about this regarding the protagonists and the heroes in horror films. Because I've noticed that there's like often perhaps, and this is maybe like a trick of Hollywood marketing, perhaps, where certain protagonists, and by protagonists, I kind of refer to those figures in horror movies who end up living, are not killed off
Yeah.
by the end. And you notice that they tend to be the ones that the director is trying to formulate a strong identification on behalf of the viewer with them.
Yeah.
That's why I would call them a protagonist.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about those choices that you see of the choice of different protagonists, because like I feel like maybe a recipe for success of a horror movie is the construction of like a very compelling protagonist or
Mm.
hero right from the beginning. That and like often it's like an unassuming person that doesn't see themselves as challenged in life, and then some event happens where they become capable of doing great things. and
Mm.
and then they survive through it somehow miraculously. So we identify with them, and then there's all of those like spoof horror movies like Army of Darkness or Scream,
Mhm.
where they kind of do these like hyperbolic heroes, right? Where it's like I'm thinking of Army of Darkness, where like the hero is this like, super machismo, like badass guy. But often in like most, like, let's say like sincere Hollywood horror movies, I feel like there's like this formula for the protagonist to be like a highly unexpected, maybe even unimpressive individual
Hmm.
who then, through the plot, through the experience of the film, like becomes something. So like, is there like a theory of like
Mm.
self-becoming in horror movies that you can think of, right? Whereby like by the end they've become the hero or protagonist has actually become someone different, and
Mhm.
that also maybe in a weird way inspires us as viewers.
Yeah.
I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you have thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. In the book, I don't touch on specifically on this theory of the positionality of the protagonist, but I certainly, in a kind of maybe indirect way, um, do explore the way that, as you say, sometimes, a character, the main character or the protagonist of a horror film, sometimes they do start off being sort of unremarkable. They're maybe inexperienced or innocent about some facet or darkness of life. And they're oftentimes unwittingly pushed to confront things that ordinarily they would have avoided.
Right.
And now they're in this kind of like state of, I suppose, a crisis of survival. Like they feel
Right.
compelled to survive.
Right.
A great example of this is the Phantasm franchise, which I do touch on in the section on aliens.
Mm.
Um, but also They Live, which of course Slavoj Žižek talked about, this great film by John Carpenter,
Yeah.
um, as well as the movie Excision, and certainly you could argue actually, I'm just looking through my list here, the movie The Addiction,
Well, I was thinking the Twilight Saga as
the
well,
Twilight Saga, yeah,
right?
totally.
Because
Donnie Darko also.
Donnie Darko, yeah, he goes through major transformations, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So like that
exactly.
whole like theory of transformation is so interesting to me because I feel like, Bella in Twilight becomes this like object of romantic um contestation
Yeah.
between like, but like in a way she actually doesn't, she remains like highly consistent, and like that
Mm.
consistency is probably one of the reasons why viewers are so identified with her, because she's actually like, she has a certain repose or a certain strength in the face of it, you know and
Mm.
like that. So that's like an interesting thing. I was just thinking about reading your book. It's like, is there like a theory of heroism across a lot of these movies? And I feel like there kind of is.
I think so too. There is heroism, but in a very specific way pertaining to overcoming, like processing some identified fear and obstacle, like horrific obstacle, and overcoming it. Now, sometimes in the horror movie, the person sort of goes through that suffering, is transformed, comes out on the other side, and they're a radically different person. They're sort of like, maybe they're more cynical, maybe they're more nihilistic, like darkly nihilistic, or they it is more of a hero's arc in the kind of classical way of transcending a lot. Some David Lynch films do this, like, in particular, I'm thinking of Inland Empire, for example, and Wild at Heart. He puts his characters through that kind of course of suffering. They are radically changed and transformed, and they emerge transcended. Now, that may be because he was a practitioner of transcendental meditation, and that was something that he was looking to illustrate in his films as an artist. But in some other examples, the protagonist is actually worse off on the other side. Like they go through all of this suffering, and you're kind of led to think that there's something better at the end of it, and they will overcome, and there will be like some sort of psychic reprieve, but there isn't. It just gets worse, and there's something to that too, because that's touching on an inherent fear that we have, that there's no dawn after the dark.
Right.
There's that actually things do get worse. And I think just engaging with that at a psychic level, that notion in itself, and sitting with that anxiety and not running away from it, really kind of taking it seriously, I think that practice and that exercise itself is healthy, because the alternative is to just deny and avoid it and pretend that fear doesn't exist. And that's when, of course, it dominates us.
No, for sure. And I feel like, that's the secret of I don't know, maybe you could call it like a transference, but like maybe that's not the right term. But the idea being that through the identification that we have with these figures who go through kind of a process of self-becoming and overcoming, we identify with them so strongly that identification kind of lives on beyond the film, and it like actually inspires us, so like implants something that like motivates us, or like kind of touches on something maybe even primordial inside of us, like some kind of like deeper reservoir of our own strength, like our own resolve, like this, to watch people survive impossible scenarios is actually like a very cathartic thing at the end of it. It could be, right? It could be, right?
I agree. I really
Right?
think so. Even if there is no positive resolve for the character, even if the protagonist goes through further suffering at the end of it, there still is the potential for a kind of honest look at that fear and the cathartic response that is potentially accessible to us. Yeah, for sure. And it is fascinating, as just to kind of touch on this again, like that the fact that oftentimes these characters are in horror, they don't possess they're not like superheroes, they're just ordinary people,
Right.
And there's something, as you say, very identifiable with that, and it's a universal thing, and they're sort of charged to have this experience that is externalized, as whether it's a vampire, a zombie, a ghost, a serial killer, whatever it may be, a home invader. There's something within that relational dynamic that is calling upon a buried part of themselves to resurface. And then by the extension of that is that the viewer also has that experience too.
Absolutely. And it reminds me, I don't know if you've covered, I'm sure that you have in all your whole podcast career arc, but if you haven't, I would love to maybe in the future talk to you about the theme of revenge movies.
Yeah, great theme.
they're so interesting to me, in the sense that like they're psychoanalytically rich, and like the perversity of the enjoyment we derive from them. And I always feel a little bit guilty for enjoying them, because there's something about them that I don't know, touches on social injustice, but forces us to celebrate the act of revenge, which is actually like a taboo. Like it like invites us to participate in something that is like, I don't know, kind of antisocial, if that makes sense, or kind of like regressive even. So it's actually like a bad enjoyment to at the end of the day. But I'd love to talk to you about that in the future. And so as I promised at the beginning, I wanted to shift gears and open up a conversation about any advice that you might give to other folks listening. I have a really active Patreon and for
Mm,
emancipations, and I think that a lot of people are probably wondering, either they love listening to podcasts and they may be wondering how they might start their own.
mm,
What advice might you give to an aspiring podcaster? Not necessarily somebody that's focusing on psychoanalysis, but perhaps like
mm.
just like in general, like what um how they might get started, how they might specify the thematic of their show, and perhaps anything else that comes to mind.
Sure, sure. Yeah, definitely. I think that for me, how podcasting started was really focusing on just another medium for talking about psychoanalysis and cinema. I'd already been doing my lectures at the Freud Museum, and I was looking at maybe another medium to express my thoughts on it, and maybe some thoughts that were not so tidily formed and like perfectly resolved, just a place to free associate and experiment, with style and format. And so how I began it, there was a lot of, there were some things that I had to overcome to begin with. And I know this seems like such a practical point to pick up on, but it is really relevant. You have to become really comfortable with hearing your own voice to start with. That seems like a given, and maybe not a lot of people who are considering starting their own podcast have even given this any thought. But remember, you're going to have to sit down and edit yourself. You have like the raw audio file and you sit down and you listen back and you maybe remove things or whatever it may be. And you really have to look and just listen compassionately at yourself. That may not be an easy feat at first, that might actually bring up some things. It did for me. I had like almost like a phobia of hearing my own voice. I was one of those people back in the day where I couldn't even stand hearing my voice on like an answering machine. It just made me sort of like cringe, but
Right.
but through the podcasting practice, and it had to be a practice, I had to return to it regularly, and
Right.
consistently. Um, I learned to show my own voice compassion. So that's not just the sound of your voice, it's also what you're saying. So once you're sort of in a comfortable place and you can hold your own voice with compassion, then some amazing stuff can happen. There's a lot of magic in that, and potential in that. My advice is to record, like, don't leave long periods of time. Don't wait until you have this perfect idea and perfect setup and your production notes are perfect. That is the antithesis of a good practice.
Mm.
You have to allow for error. You have to just roll with the spontaneity of podcasting and recording,
Right.
and you have to just kind of like um, foster momentum. Foster a pace that means that you're recording once a week. If you can
Mm.
aim for that, and it doesn't have to be like an hour and a half once a week, to start with, it doesn't have to be that. It can be like you start with 15 minutes and you'll find that the more you do it, the more you want to say, and the shyness goes away, and you have options. You can either record on your own, or you can invite guests. You can have like a dialogue like we're having now. So there are like different ways that you can do it. I would say also like find something you're really passionate about and whittle it down to a manageable size. Don't try to be everything for everyone. Don't try to crowd please, because audiences can hear inauthenticity. You will be your most authentic when you're talking about something that like really turns you on, in the Freudian sense of the eros, and animates you, and you have like that thing in your voice, that it factor that makes people want to listen to you. So don't take that for granted. That's magic, and it's gold dust. Make sure that you're talking about something you love. Don't be following trends or do like hashtags for the sake of it. Like really tune in to your own voice and talk about things that make you come alive. So those are my main
That's
things.
amazing.
Be regular with it and speak freely.
Sure. So I have a question. So when you do a recording where it's just you solo,
Yeah.
you're not reading a script per se. Is that right? How,
No.
or are you, so what is your process, that you sort of have like notes and you then just build off of them, or what?
Yeah, exactly. I build my producer notes just to give myself a guideline of what topics to hit in what sequence.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes if there's some definition that I have to read out and I want to get that exactly right word for word, if it's like a psychoanalytic term or something like that, I will type those out in advance. But no, I don't read out scripts. The only times that I will read out entire texts are specifically if it's like an ASMR show of me reading like an essay by Freud or something like that. But as far
Right.
as my own solo shows, it's just top line bullet points and I riff off of those.
So you said ASMR. Now, can you how do you what's the art form of creating those? And for the benefit of people that don't know what that is, although I'm sure everybody does, can you just briefly define that? But also, like, how do you technically do that?
Sure. So ASMR is autonomous sensory meridian response. And all it is, it's anything that produces a kind of like what is felt and perceived as a tingling sensation or some sort of pleasant form of paresthesia. And it's sometimes people report that it begins usually like on the scalp and moves back down the back of your neck, or gives you like chills or whatever. That might not occur for everyone, but I've found that speaking in a certain way on certain episodes that call for it, of course, ASMR is a great technique for bringing your audience into what you want to convey to them. It's like, and this is like going to be personalized to every person. Every different person is going to have a unique approach to ASMR. It's being very mindful of your tone and your voice, and producing an oral environment where the kind of recording is soothing, and the decibels are in check, and you're in this sort of like almost like a womb like sound environment where you're contained and you have your listeners right there with you. And in my experience, the feedback I've received is that this is actually the state where people are most receptive to receiving your teachings, if that's the type of podcasting you want to do. The learning potential is very high in ASMR because you're almost hypnotizing your listeners, you're almost
Wow.
mesmerizing them sonically, and so that could be like a way of entering into podcasting. There are ways of learning ASMR.
How did you learn it, out of curiosity?
I basically just listened to a lot of ASMR content on YouTube,
Uh-huh.
and I noticed, I paid very close attention to how that made me feel. I was like identifying certain things that were happening for me, and I felt so relaxed and I felt so at peace, and it was like a positive ritual to return to. It's very meditative. And just by virtue of listening to ASMR content, I learned it. Now, I don't know whether I'm like, this all is very subjective and relative. Some people might not think that I sound that way, but I have heard that feedback. Um,
Sure.
and I find it very useful, and because this is the type of thing that maybe could be a positive thing to foster, having like a really an environment where people feel relaxed. It's also, you're offering something different to some other podcasts out there that are more like shock jockey, and they're like rattling you all the time and they're yelling and screaming. Now
Right.
that's very addicting, but in the long run, I don't know whether that is sustainable, So,
No,
um,
it's really interesting. No, it would be a really interesting challenge for someone like myself because I
hmm,
really just started doing podcasting as an extension of my scholarly and academic writing, and also to get access to authors that I adore and love, and like,
hmm,
just to interview them. And I've never, I mean, I invested in a high quality mic setup, and like I care about quality, of course, but I don't take it to this level. And I think you're inspiring me to think about what that might mean.
yeah,
Um, that's really cool. Yeah, thank you for that. I
sure
appreciate
thing.
that. And I just really appreciate your work in general. And I'm very happy that you joined me today.
Thank
Um,
you.
Congratulations on this book. And, I hope it gets a very wide readership. And can you tell us um, again what the second book vision is? I think you mentioned it briefly. Maybe you can elaborate about that. And then also, um, is the podcast that inspired your book, is it still going?
Yes, yes. So the podcast that inspired the book, Evolution of Horror podcast, um, with host Mike Munzer, that is still going. It's still thriving. So you can tune in. Currently, the host is looking at man-made monsters. So it's like
Mm,
science and horror. It's really good stuff, including like Frankenstein, that kind of stuff. So I'm contributing to that. And I'm producing these new segments for him all the time, which that's what makes me think I will probably do a volume 2 of Psychoanalyzing Horror Cinema. And in terms of my second book, which I'm now sketching out, it's going to be an autofictional account and illustration of feminine jouissance following the plot of the movie Contact, directed
that's
by
right. That's right.
Robert Zemeckis. Yeah. So that's my plan. In fact, I'm going to be going out to the Western American states next month for a couple of months to write. So I'm really, really excited about that. And I just want to say, Daniel, I'm really so thankful that you invited me on your podcast to talk about my book and these other ideas that we've been exchanging. It's been such a great conversation. Thank you.
Yes, it's always really fun to speak to somebody so well versed in psychoanalytic thought. And I think we build off of one another's ideas quite a lot. And if you're interested in pursuing something on revenge films, let me know. I have many thoughts, especially about the Liam Neeson
Mm-hmm.
genre after he made the film called Taken.
Mm-hmm.
He's now created like 30 of those. It's like Taken part 45. It's like never ending.
Yeah.
And my wife always makes fun of me because I gain so much enjoyment out of them. But again, it's a guilty enjoyment. Because I don't see myself as a revengeful person, or I don't want to see myself that way. But like, sometimes you enjoy things and you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Um, but maybe we could do that in the future. But
I'd love to. Yeah, that would be a great discussion. I'm a big fan of revenge films. I think Tarantino does some good ones in that
yeah,
genre.
yeah, definitely. Okay, very good. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope that you all benefited from listening to Mary's brilliant expositions, and especially to this wonderful advice, which was so, I kind of like threw that in last minute.
Hmm.
But you answered it very, very like helpfully and in depth
Thank
and
you.
practically. So that's super, super useful. I might like cut that and put that at the beginning because I think a lot of people would really benefit from that.
Thank you. That's so kind. I really appreciate that.
All right, everyone. Until next time, take good care.